Oops, sorry, wrong film.
You think you're so great because you have boats!
The new Napoleon film by Ridley Scott was bad. Was really bad. From an overall movie standpoint, the acting was the plot didn't make much sense, and it was overall a boring experience. But more importantly for me, the history, in a movie about a historical subject, was devastatingly and egregiously inaccurate. The movie just completely misunderstands the Napoleonic Wars, and more importantly, Napoleon himself. Now, this isn't to say that everything in the movie was inaccurate or bad. There was a lot of things that were very surprisingly extremely accurate, which I will get to later. But for now, first I wanted to start off with all the things I simply make this a bad movie and are not necessarily issues with the history. My gripes in this regard revolve around two main issues: the character development and pacing, all in all leading to an overall boring and confusing mess. My main issue with the character development in the movie is that there really wasn't any. Part of a good story is the fact that we get to watch the characters grow and evolve over the course of the story, for better or worse, especially the main characters. To those who would say a historical example is more complicated, you would be right. But in the case of Napoleon, there's a fairly clear, well-documented arc to his quote-unquote character. You can have character development in a historical movie, especially when the real-life person evolved noticeably over time. And famously, Napoleon himself said his life would make a good novel. Not to get ahead of myself here on discussing the historical issues with this movie, but one of the most interesting things about Napoleon is his journey from being a champion of the Republic and a Jacobin, one of the most radical factions in the New Republic, and a friend of the Robespierres, to an enlightened dictator, yet undeniably great reformer, to an increasingly deluded and aggrandized emperor whose over a decade of unparalleled success weakened his decision-making capabilities. More simply put, impoverished noble turns revolutionary, turns savior of public order, and enlightened ruler turns increasingly despotic emperor is a literal perfect character arc served up on a silver platter for anyone adapting the story of Napoleon into real life. Now, admittedly, there are counterviews to say Napoleon was always a bad person, but you can still have an interesting character arc taking that perspective into account. In this version, he disguises his true feelings and was always plotting to overthrow the Republic and conquer Europe. But in order to do so, even if you don't like him, you have to recognize he is still super intelligent, even if his motives are not as sympathetic as the first version. But Ridley Scott's version was a pouty man-child who happens to be a soldier, does soldiery things, gets upset when his wife cheats on him, and also goes and fights battles sometimes. That's it. That's all that happens in this movie. We get no character motivation for why he is doing things, other than the fact that he's in love with Josephine, which just takes the agency out of a man who had maybe some of the most ambition since Alexander, and the will to achieve it. There's no evolution of a rise and a fall and the reasons why, the actual interesting bits about Napoleon's life. This is not even to mention the other characters in the movie. Other than Napoleon and Josephine, we get almost no other characters in this entire movie of any substance. Yes, we get introduced by name to a few important historical figures, but then for almost every single one of them, if not every single one of them, they're never mentioned again halfway through the film. This is just absolutely insane. Maybe in real life, historical figures just drop off the map, never to be seen again. The Abbe Sieyès is a great example of this. They did do that fairly well in the movie. He shows up for one scene and then is never heard from again because he's not important to the overall tale. But in a story and in real life, there are other critical players in this Napoleonic soap opera that make the story so much more interesting. Talleyrand is the best example. They do actually give him some of the most screen time in the entire movie out of anyone other than Napoleon and Josephine, but we get none of his interesting character of him scheming and betraying Napoleon. He just disappears and we never see him again. So he does actually show up at the Congress of Vienna, but me having watched this movie twice, I didn't even notice him sitting there. And the fact that he doesn't get any lines whatsoever, I just personally don't count this. The other is Napoleon's brother Lucien, who also gets some of the most screen time in the movie, and is, I think, fairly decently portrayed at the beginning. However, the relationship that they are even brothers is not really portrayed very well. For one of the people so critical at the beginning of the movie, being in a lot of the scenes with him, we think he would be more important, or at least we would know what would happen to him. Nope, we just never hear from him again after the beginning. Simple as that. Very interesting characters who do get a bit of spotlight are just thrown aside once they've been used to advance what little plot there is, and not always in historically accurate ways. One important exception is Josephine. If this movie had been called Josephine and not Napoleon, and we had more Josephine scenes like was supposed to be originally intended, this movie probably actually would have worked fairly well. Telling it from her perspective, take out all the battle scenes because she was never there. I think this would actually have been a very refreshing take and very interesting. Other than Josephine, none of the characters are very interesting at all. My other issue with the movie part of this is the pacing. I think that's what I mean. I'm not very sure. I'm not a movie expert. Something feels strange to me in the fact that it feels very, very rushed and nothing is ever explained. And so to me, that's a pacing issue where the movie never takes time to actually explain anything and just goes from scene to scene. And especially when you're trying to tell the 20-year span of when Napoleon was in the public eye. Admittedly, you do have to jump around, but they don't do it well. And so then you just end up jumping forward constantly between him spending time with Josephine and him fighting battles, and you don't understand the context whatsoever. And a mark of a good film would have been them doing the context well, and you actually understanding what was going on, instead of just being like, oh, here's another battle. Not really sure why they're fighting it, or what's going on, which that really is, that's going back to the characterization of Napoleon's character arc, is why he's fighting all those battles, is an important part of his character, and they just don't really explain it. Moving on to the historical issues with the movie, there's some big ones here that I have major problems with. The first and probably most annoying for me personally, that Napoleon was objectively a very intelligent person. The fact that this movie attempts to portray him as a moron, which I don't think anyone who watched this movie would disagree with, is an incredible decision. I just don't understand how they got there. Actually, I do understand how they got there. To portray Napoleon as an idiot and as a moron soldier who just cares about his wife cheating on him. It's a reduction of his character that doesn't even come from reality. Usually in the actual historiography of historians writing about Napoleon, there are three versions. The godlike reincarnation of Alexander, Hannibal, Caesar, and Octavian, all in one. The middle ground, who recognized Napoleon had good and bad traits, and that was one of the smartest statesmen of all time, up until he started making bad decisions under the empire. The people who think he was a smart guy but had bad intentions the entire time, and don't like his personality. And then the last being that Napoleon was the literal antichrist, but also a moron. It's those two middle ones where you'll find most historians. Most credible historians. Unfortunately for this movie, the director seems to lie in the fourth option of depicting Napoleon as the Antichrist, but also a moron. I don't really have to point out that it is the two middle neutral options that Napoleon was a human and had good and bad traits. But if someone seeks to deny his accomplishments as simple flukes or dumb luck, they are completely ignoring the man's unique and frankly stunning victories and accomplishments. But it is that combination of the height of human achievement in one man, administratively with the civil code and reforms in France, to some of the most decisive and impressive battles in human history, contrasted with the tragic downfall, tragic meaning bad ending for the main character, it is a fascinating tale worthy of the silver screen. Unfortunately, the writers and director of this movie did not choose to present that deep and interesting version of Napoleon that makes us question our own accomplishments and failures, but choose to focus on the fourth version, the Antichrist and dumb idiot version. If you actually watch the movie, it's quite clear that the intent is to portray Napoleon as a dumb soldier who kind of just bops along through his career, helped by others, getting lucky, until his luck runs out in Russia. It's such a childish version that it's not even a simplification, it's simply complete fiction. It's also worth noting that usually the people who subscribe to this fourth model are British. Oh, guess what? Ridley Scott is British. This isn't to say all British people think this way, but I will provide another famous example of a YouTuber who many of you may be familiar with, Lindy Beige. If you watch any of his content about Napoleon, you'll end up with normally he's really good, but you'll end up with some of the most vitriolic stuff you'll ever hear. I love Lindy Beige, but it's one of my issues with him. I think it's just a function of the way Napoleon is taught as one of the big baddies in British history. It's not really their fault. It's kind of understandable. But the fact that they base most of their historical and nationalistic view of Napoleon is based on the propaganda from the time period and is completely actually removed from reality, it is unfortunate. And then you end up in these situations where someone has a long career and is probably a very smart person just ends up making drastic mistakes like this. I mean, I'm not blaming Ridley Scott. I think it's just a function of the way the British look at Napoleonic history, which it's understandable. But the equivalent for Americans would be having a British person who has a very negative view of George Washington making a movie about the American Revolution called Washington. This is not to say that all British people are like this, and there's some very credible British historians who are professional historians who either like Napoleon or at the very least recognize that he's not a big dumb idiot. So I'm not blanketly claiming that all British people fall to their own 1800s propaganda, but I'm just bringing it up because it's important to understand that you can fairly definitively see it in Ridley Scott's portrayal of Napoleon. A lot can be made as well from the reasons Ridley Scott cast Joaquin Phoenix, reasons he said himself, the self-stated reasons being that he saw Joaquin Phoenix play the Joker in The Joker and his past work in Gladiator. 2 films where Joaquin Phoenix plays an insane psychopath. It tells you a lot about where Scott is coming from in his bias towards Napoleon. But like I said before, to be fair to Scott, this isn't really his fault. He is British. Some more examples of the inaccurate portrayal of his character during the movie that I think are just worth pointing out because they're so egregious are having him fall asleep during a political discussion with Broers, or generally acting like a child. It's ridiculous and insulting that they chose to portray him this way. Another is Napoleon leaving his army in Egypt to be with Josephine, and leaving Elba to be with Josephine. I get the point in this movie is to play up the relationship and have it be a driving force. It just makes him look like a sad cuckold, not giving a damn about his troops or anything else just so he can get back to Josephine. This is just complete fiction. They even show British propaganda in the movie. Literally, the movie is closer to British propaganda than real life, which is wild that a British director is still under the influence of that rather than the truth. In reality, Napoleon left Egypt for a variety of reasons, but mostly because it seemed like the whole country was collapsing while he was gone. And also the fact that it wasn't going well. It's the two. It really didn't have much to do with Josephine. Then in regards to Elba, Josephine was already dead for months before Napoleon left Elba. It's just an example of them giving Napoleon non-complex motivations that are not very interesting when his real ones were super complex and more interesting. I'm not saying that things can't be simplified for a film, but completely making things up and basically defaming his character is just simply too far. Also, as an example, I would not be so angry if they portrayed it as a combination of the two, but the fact that they present him as a single-minded fool who cares nothing about his army and only about Josephine, when it could be very much argued that the two are in very real competition with each other for Napoleon's affection. In reality to this buffoonery that's portrayed in this whole movie, Napoleon was undeniably one of the smartest people of the time. Historian Michael Broer says that likely the only 2 people who could compete with Napoleon in intellect at the time was Thomas Jefferson and Toussaint Louverture. Even those who hated Napoleon and everything he stood for recognized he was extremely intelligent. Quote, few contemporaries of comparable intelligence or originality ever doubted Napoleon was something extraordinary, for good or ill. Basically, those who hated him most, quote, never lost their admiration for his personal abilities nor ever disparaged his ferocious intellect. This includes his most famous critics, including Madame de Staël and Chateaubriand. By portraying him as an idiot, it just removes one of the most fascinating things about Napoleon's story, that someone who can rise so far can also come right back down. I think this is where the movie falls flat. It throws out some of the most compelling things about the Napoleonic Wars and what makes them interesting, and substitutes them for versions that misunderstand the period entirely. Now, I'm not saying it would be easy to adapt the Napoleonic Wars correctly, or even that one needs to try and be 100% historically accurate. I actually think it's okay to be a little bit historically inaccurate if the twin aim is to 1, still achieve a correct overall vibe of the period you are trying to depict, and 2, making a good and interesting movie that people can comprehend. In Ridley Scott's Napoleon, the whole house of cards kind of collapses on the fact they didn't even get the general vibe of Napoleon correct. It's just super off and knocks the whole time period off balance, and thus tells a confused and not very interesting story in the end, making a bad movie. Finally, I come to probably one of my largest issues with how Napoleon is portrayed in the movie. And it comes down to the casting. Why, in God's name, did Ridley Scott choose Joaquin Phoenix to play Napoleon? One could presume it's because Phoenix in Gladiator was actually pretty decent and a very interesting choice to play the supposedly crazy Roman emperor. But Phoenix was 24 years old in Gladiator. Did Ridley Scott forget more than 20 years have passed since its filming? Phoenix probably would have been a completely reasonable casting choice when he was 24, because I can't stress this enough. One of the most important factors of Napoleon is that he was extremely young. During most of the time period depicted in the movie, he is in his 20s. Phoenix is in his late 40s and looks even older. It takes away the magic and awe of the little corporal. Part of the reason they called him that was because he was so young. Napoleon was 30 when he became consul. By the time he was Phoenix's age, he was already on St. Helena and almost dead. The biggest nail in the coffin for this point is that in a movie that prides itself on focusing in on the relationship between Napoleon and Josephine, one of the most crucial elements in understanding their relationship is that Josephine was 6 years older than Napoleon. It is part of the reason she could not have children. In many respects, she was the more intelligent one when it came to society, courtly etiquette, and manners. In reality, the actors they chose make Napoleon look and feel 14 years older than Josephine, because that is how old Joaquin Phoenix is compared to Vanessa Kirby, who I think probably did the best job out of anyone here, to give her credit. It's just a huge, unfortunate missed opportunity to actually understanding the relationship at the heart of this movie, and totally turns the relationship on its head in not a great way. With my biggest gripe about the movie out of the way, that being Napoleon himself, let's get into some of the other things less than great about the movie. And actually some things that were fairly decent. Okay, so they at least got the start date of the French Revolution right. We get a couple seconds of Swiss guards in their red uniforms, which is accurate and a nice touch considering most audiences would probably associate red uniforms with the British. Also a nice callback to an old video. And I will say just about the costumes in this movie, I'm not an expert on historical fashion and uniforms and such, but from what I can tell, everything is very well done. That is one mark that this movie does get. The costuming, whoever's in charge of costuming did an amazing job. An error here at the beginning is that we spend 10 seconds in 1789 and then jump to 1792 with no warning whatsoever, and it makes it appear as if it all is happening in 1789, which is very wrong. Like, the scene where they're being chased down the hallway and hiding with the children does take place in 1792, and it even says so in the script. These buildings are painfully British looking for somewhere that's supposed to be Paris. The white hair is definitely accurate and correct, because it famously did go stark white before her execution and when she was in captivity. But I have no idea what's going on with her hair being straight in the back and crazy in the front. No idea what's happening here. It also would have been cut off beforehand, so the executioner doesn't have to do this. And we have a sketch by Jacques-Louis David, who was along the route that she processed, and he actually did a sketch of what she looked like. Napoleon just wasn't there. He was in the south of France at the siege of Toulon, where the next portion of this movie takes place. They were simultaneous events. He was actually there on August 10th, 1792, when the Swiss guards were massacred, which is actually that scene we just saw previously with them in the hallway. Oh, and I'm going to keep bringing it up because it's absolutely awful. Napoleon was 24 when this happened. Joaquin Phoenix looks like he's 60. I think Toulon is actually probably the least bad of the battles, bordering on good here. I think it's unlikely the British would have been drunk and not watching what was happening, considering they had been under siege for months and they knew the French were close by, and they had already repulsed multiple attacks. So this kind of strangely actually lessens Napoleon's first victory in a way by saying the British were completely incompetent. Overall, like I said, very accurate. He did actually have his horse shot out from under him. Strangely, they don't show him being stabbed in the leg by a bayonet, which was his only major wound during all of his campaigns. Survivor's Ball is based on a real phenomenon that happened after the fall of the Jacobins in Robespierre. So I do actually like this scene, and Napoleon actually did meet Josephine at a party sponsored by Broers. It's actually one of the better in the movie. So unfortunately, as you may have noticed, I don't have clips for the whole movie. I'm just grabbing what's available online. So for this next part in particular, where I'm talking about specific scenes, I unfortunately don't have clips for every single one of them, so you'll just have to bear it with me, because I still think they're worth discussing. The scene where he's screwing around with his brother is just made absolutely ridiculous by the fact that, once again, Joaquin Phoenix is ancient, and Matthew Needham, the actor playing Lucien, at least looks young, but when Lucien was supposed to be 19 and Napoleon was 25, the scene makes sense with two young people, but not one who's nearly middle-aged and the other who is old. The scene where Eugène comes to Napoleon asking for his father's sword is actually a period-accurate fabrication by Hortense and Eugène, Josephine's children, who made it up after the fact on how they met Napoleon and how he... Which I'm okay with that being in the movie. It's a period-accurate fabrication, if you will. It's from the imagination of those at the time. And it's a very interesting scene, even if it didn't actually happen. I do appreciate the subtle Napoleon almost forgets his hat because he's in love with Josephine and is running out of the room. Almost. It's a nice small touch. At 2710, they do actually use the Pride and Prejudice theme as the Napoleon and Josephine love theme. It's not even re-recorded. It's just straight up the track from Pride and Prejudice, which is pretty funny. That I also basically approve of the whiff of grape shot scene, or the 13 vendémiaire, which is when Napoleon just famously dispersed a crowd with a whiff of grape shot, even though he didn't actually say that. It's pretty good and largely accurate, and it hasn't been presented on the screen before in any other movies or films, so that's cool. It wasn't in as big as The Square, but I think it really shows how devastating grape shot is, especially on civilians. Oh, this is really bad. They skipped the Italian campaign. Literally the most dramatic and interesting of all his campaigns, and arguably the most important, way more so than Egypt. This is just absolutely crazy. For a movie so focused on the war aspects, this is borderline ridiculous. I know there's limited time, but it would be like making a movie about Alexander the Great. You have him screwing around in Greece and then teleporting to Egypt, missing all the really important battles that set up his whole career. In the Italian campaign, you have the Battle of Arcole, where Napoleon literally tries to lead a charge across a bridge into enemy fire, gets pushed off into a swamp, and nearly drowns. Which to me fits the vibe of the movie, which is semi-real / mockery they are going for. In Egypt, they try and recreate all the famous paintings of Napoleon in Egypt, which I appreciate. Also, why in the world are these cannons pointed upwards? Also, the pyramids were 9 miles away. I can't even. Also, why would you even try and hit them with cannonballs? Why would you waste your ammo? It's not just the pyramid in the foreground being hit. They're aiming at all the pyramids. This is just a ridiculous scene. It also makes it seem like the freaking Mamluks have never seen cannons before. And he gets so scared he falls off his horse. Legitimately just mildly racist. They also failed to mention the important context that Napoleon's decision to bring a whole team of scientists and academics with him started modern Egyptology and reintroduced Egypt to Europe. All of that is just ignored, and they just have Napoleon staring at a mummy looking like a moron. Like, the real reason he would have actually been checking out mummies is because there would have been scientists there, in proto-Egyptologists, actually interested in the science and the history of it. It just makes him look like a goof. This scene is accurate, though, with his officers having to convince him that Josephine was having an affair. His reaction, though, is not. The reaction in the movie is that he just completely abandons the campaign. His answer in real life was that he took his own mistress. This newspaper of the British making fun of his love letters to Josephine is real. The British fleet intercepted his letters home to Josephine from Egypt and then published them. Just the scenes where he just screams at Josephine that he's not built like other men and that he's a megalomaniac, they just don't ring true at this point in history. Yes, they had a stormy relationship, but they just make him look like an idiot here. Once again, the use of the Pride and Prejudice theme as Napoleon and Josephine's love theme instead of writing something original. I do like the hints from this point on of Josephine asking for him not to leave her is very on point. I think it may come a little early in the timeline, but him having to move away for basically diplomatic reasons is one of the real tragedies that did occur, that two people in love with each other did have to split up for reasons of state. And I think that this is a good way of approaching it in the movie, and it is something I think it did right. For the planning of the coup, we get that others were planning a coup and inviting Napoleon, which is accurate, but we don't get to see any of his own craftiness in the situation. Once again, playing up the situation that he's just kind of a dumb military guy who gets lucky off others' plans. But that said, the actual way the coup plays out in the movie, I think it got fairly accurate. I really like the way Talleyrand goes to Barras to get him to sign. That interaction seems on par. The music is good too, maybe a bit too funny. It's good though. It's Haydn Symphony. In the whole coup scene where Napoleon is actually at the Council of 500, Saint-Cloud, is very accurate. It's the one time Napoleon kind of messed up in public and actually gets mobbed by people and then runs away. It does a great way of showing that. And it's also, the building is accurate to what it basically would have looked like at the time. The costumes are accurate. Even their funny little hats of the members of the assembly. You have the big windows on the side of the building. The original building is long gone, so they get a pass anyway, but it's very well done. We don't get the members jumping out of the windows, unfortunately, like supposedly happened in real life, which apparently was in the script, but they didn't film it, or it didn't make the final cut, which I think is funny because it was one of the most ridiculous moments of that when Napoleon came back into the room with soldiers, that they all fled. They ran away, and it was just kind of dispersed. The thing with Lucien being there and helping Napoleon and pointing the sword at him, that basically all really happened. This whole sequence is good. Okay, well, I actually do like the scene of them pulling up to the Louvre stand-in, which the script does confirm this is meant to be the Tuileries Palace, even though they got something to look like the modern Louvre with its kind of U-shape. That's not what the Tuileries looked like at the time. It was an enclosed courtyard. And also, when he first became consul, he didn't live there yet anyway. He lived at the Petit Luxembourg right after the coup, because they still had some modesty at this point. He might have worked at the Tuileries. Anyway, it's just, there's a couple things wrong with that. I do like the scenes of Josephine being at home, at court, schmoozing with people, because that's what she was really good at, and Napoleon necessarily wasn't. We don't get any of the sly politicking Napoleon did after the coup to actually make himself take full control and get into power. It just never kind of said. And therefore we just lose the craftiness of Napoleon. We just lose all of that. He just walks into power. Nothing is explained. It just feels like it happened by an accident. Oh god, the interactions with the British ambassador just make him seem like a petulant child. Geez, how do you get it this wrong? Like, the boat comment is funny, but Trafalgar hadn't even happened yet, and it really just does a disservice to his actual character. Also, it wasn't even in the original script. It does appear as if Joaquin Phoenix or Ridley Scott ad-libbed that line. Also, the fact that 5 minutes movie-wise from him becoming first consul to that they suggest that he become a king, it just makes it seem like he immediately became king, which once again does a little bit of a disservice to his character. Okay, this is actually a very important point that I probably should have brought up at the beginning. We get none of Napoleon's civilian accomplishments. We get nothing of the Napoleonic Code, nothing of his work ethic, nothing of him staying up till 3 a.m. working on papers. Like, all we needed was one scene of him sitting at his desk under candlelight, just recreating David's famous portrait. That's all we needed to do this, really, in a movie. I'd be okay with that, but we get none of that. The fact that Napoleon and Josephine's sex life gets so much screen time and we literally get none of Napoleon actually being smart tells you all you need to know about this movie. It also ignores the fact they did actually have a real family dynamic, as Napoleon adopted Josephine's 2 children and came to love both of them. Michael Broer, who I mentioned earlier, Napoleonic historian, states that they were the 2 pillars in his life. So that to make him out to be this monster with no family and just this awful dynamic with Josephine is just simply not true. He had 2 of the people he loved most in his life were his 2 stepchildren, which I think is an important part to understanding his character. The coronation. I generally like the vibe. The costumes seem good. You can tell it's not real ermine on his cloak, but I'm not about killing however hundreds of ermine to get the pelts for that, obviously, so that's fine. Other costumes are great. The fact that it's not in a French cathedral does bother me, and it's clearly not a French Gothic cathedral, because it would have been in Notre Dame. Obviously, they can't use Notre Dame right now because it's under complete renovation. That bothers me. I think probably the thing that they get the most... No, there is something worse later. One of the things they get wrong, very wrong, is the music is in German. Yeah, I don't know whose bright idea it was to have the French Emperor's coronation music be in German. Haydn's creation, which I get it's period accurate, but when you actually think about it, it's so dumb. And I probably understand that most people don't know or even realize it's in German, and it sounds regal enough, but it just hurts. By the way, if you're wondering what the real coronation music was, it was by Italian composer Picello, but the reason they definitely didn't include it is because it's really bad. Which is really unfortunate. It's just, I mean, it's not bad, it's just not interesting whatsoever at all as a piece of music. Someone actually made a really interesting edit that they uploaded to YouTube. Thank you to Brumarist. Hopefully it's okay that I play it out here. I don't think you would mind probably showing more people this clip of he actually took the time to edit the real music over top of the clip from the movie. So I'm going to let it play out while I continue talking, but it's very good. But although Picello wrote the vast majority of the music because it was an entire mass, the Coronation March by Le Sœur and Abbot Rosé's Vivat are actually good pieces and fairly decent, and they probably would have worked. And no one really cares about the music other than the people that actually care about the music, so it would have been fine to use in the movie, but they didn't. I appreciate the fact that Jacques-Louis David is in here, recognizing the giant Jacques-Louis David painting that hangs in the Louvre of the Coronation, probably one of his most famous paintings and one of the most famous paintings in the Louvre. But what he's actually doing here, it wasn't actually the first version. If we're going to be pedantic, he did it differently. He first painted the scene where Napoleon crowned himself, and the final version is Napoleon crowning Josephine. Long live the Emperor in English? If there was one moment in this entire movie where you were going to use French, it's Vive l'Empereur. It's not that hard. People understand what it means. In the script, it actually does say Vive l'Empereur. So did they think people were that dumb that they wouldn't understand what that meant? It's just one of the most famous things about Napoleon. Okay, we're at Austerlitz now. I will say Napoleon did actually personally scout terrain without escorts sometimes. This is true. But overall, this is probably one of the worst things in the movie. I have my hands over my eyes right now. This is so bad. Some of the small things first. It shows him in a big tent. Apparently he set up shop in a hovel and later in an outhouse. The tent still looks cool though. The biggest issue is just the tactical and strategic significance of Austerlitz is just completely lost. Widely considered by military historians as maybe like the most impressive battle of human history. Like it's for sure in the top 10 or even top 5. And maybe number 1. And we just get none of that. It just instantly turns into this big mosh pit in the center where he's just releasing troops and then the artillery and then the Russians just come in and send wave tactics at each other until the Russians run away and then fall in a lake. The only nod to the actual battle is he says, wait, let them think they have the higher ground when they're clearly on a flat plain in the movie. It's just ridiculous. Like, people can comprehend large set battle pieces, which are even a little complicated. You just have him standing on a hill shouting nonsense, and the cannons never fire once until the end. It's just ridiculous. It's just absolutely... If you want to actually know how the Battle of Austerlitz takes place, when you're done with this video, just look up the Battle of Austerlitz on YouTube. There are plenty of people detailing the tactical brilliance that Napoleon showed in this battle. And the luck involved too. That's also part of what makes it so interesting. And the incompetence of the Allied powers in this, and what led to their defeat. It's all of these combined. It's not just Napoleon himself, certainly helped. It's also his generals who were very instrumental in all this. It just hurts to think about that it's it's just ridiculously simplified. It's the same thing for the rest of the battles in this movie too. The Madame Mère scene, Napoleon's mother, this is not how this happened. She was his mistress, not simply a test. In the divorce scenes, we actually get some direct quotes from the real divorce documents, but him slapping her and being an asshole about it just reinforces the British in the movie's idea that he's a brute. There's just no evidence of that. Just him being physically abusive is just wrong. The after the divorce relationship is done fairly well. The fact that they were still best friends and that Napoleon came to visit her, that's good. I'm glad about that. That they make that fairly clear. They could have filmed this at Malmaison, which looks very French, and they chose the most English-looking country house imaginable. And they make it seem like she was also exiled somewhere new and foreign to her, like when she walks in the door, she has no idea where she is, like she just went to Malmaison for the first time. She had owned Malmaison for years. That was her and Napoleon's home. Many of the decisions of the empire and consulate had been made there. Very important location to her, and she basically just got exiled to her own house, just outside of Paris. It's not as big of a deal as they make it. Just skipping to Tilsit and not giving any reasons is once again jumping around, giving the audience no context for what's happening. And also this happened 2 years before the divorce. So it's just... The Moscow scenes... We're kind of going fast here, but the Moscow scenes might actually have been some of the better in the movie. I think that was done fairly well. With him sitting on the bird poop throne and then bringing horses into the cathedrals and all the fancy buildings that did happen. The burning of Moscow, obviously. The horrific trek there and back. I mean, we lose all the context for why that happened, but they're better than some of the other scenes, I guess. the fact we skipped from 1812 to 1814. I mean, we've been already skipping around a bunch, but so at this point, it's just like whatever. Also, up until this point in the movie, the music was fairly good, using historical examples for almost the entirety. But since the Russia section, we have this like Mongolian throat singing going on for like the whole rest of the movie. I don't know what's happening at this point. Having him lounging around on Elba like he wasn't doing anything, once again ignoring his exceptional drive for not being bored and having to do something and liking to work, in his drive for administrative tasks. And it's what part of made him so great. The fact that he gets to Elba, he's been exiled, the whole world hates him, and he's like, I'm going to make Elba the best place I can. We just lose all that. We just have him chilling on Elba until he decides to leave to go back to Josephine. No, because she had been dead for almost a year. He knew she was dead. It's just ridiculous. The 5th Regiment encounter, General Marchand, generally good, actually more accurate than Waterloo, but another good spot for Vive l'Empereur. If you're even just going to put it once in this movie, it would have been here. We meet Hortense for the first time since she was a child, since we saw her on that balcony at the beginning of the movie, or on the staircase. And until more than halfway through the conversation, we have no idea who she is. When I was watching this for the first time, I had no idea who it was until she was mentioned by name. I thought she was like the maid, or like the nurse to Josephine. And then when they finally brought up her name, I was like, oh my god, that's Hortense. And that was literally one of Napoleon's favorite people on the planet, who he wrote letters to constantly, which he would sign off always endearingly, like "Love Napoleon" or something like this. You can look up the letters online. It was literally his adopted daughter who he loved dearly, and we just get none of this in this scene, in the one scene where he interacts with her in the movie. It's just ridiculous. Okay, now we're at Waterloo. Once again, obviously the movie Waterloo does it better, because the whole movie's about Waterloo. And they also used literal troops to do all of it. None of it was CGI. They hired the Russian army to go out in a field and do these maneuvers in person. So clearly it's going to be better than whatever they could do. But having him charge into battle and kill someone is just absolutely ridiculous. I'm sorry. You just can't do that in a movie about Napoleon. Wellington never met Napoleon. I think that kind of wraps up my summation of why I think this was just such a bad movie historically. This could be a way longer video, but I think it's just simply not worth my time to go into something that they didn't put that much time into, frankly. And specifically by they, I mean Ridley Scott, for him to actually care about the history. I can say that fairly confidently, that the historical advisors to this movie, at least some of them, knew what they were talking about, because one of them was Michael Broers, who I use extensively throughout this video. He's a professional Napoleonic historian who deeply knows what he's talking about. My guess is he was just simply ignored, but he knows what he's talking about, and I would recommend his 3-volume set, which is very recent, coming out in the last decade, so very up-to-date research on Napoleon. It's an amazing biography, and very accurate, and very well done. It's just somewhere from the historical perspective of the historians working on the movie to the director, who obviously didn't care very much about what was happening. Something was lost in translation, and it's just unfortunate. And another thing I will say, whoever was in charge of most of the music did an amazing job, except during the Coronation, that was just weird. But all of the rest of it, usually when you're hearing classical music, except also for the Pride and Prejudice theme, it's all historically accurate, it's Haydn, it's Mozart. And even the original music written for the movie, that was played on a piano, was played on Napoleon's actual piano that he gifted to Marie Louise, that has survived all these centuries. But alas, the overall important things when you're telling a movie about Napoleon, i.e. his character and his motivations, and just everything about why he did what he did, are just kind of completely ignored in favor of this Gilray and Cruikshank's interpretation of Napoleonic history. I can almost see one of the prints in the windows saying, "You think you're so great because you have boats." And it's just a little unfortunate, because I think it basically self-destructs the whole film. When you detach it from a reality that is so interesting that there's no way you can actually make fiction more interesting than fact, in this case, that's just kind of why the movie falls apart, in my opinion. Anyway, that's my review of Ridley Scott's Napoleon. Hope you enjoyed.
The most glorious, the most august Napoleon, Emperor of the French, is crowned and enthroned. Long live the Emperor!